So thank you very much for inviting me here. I feel very, the odd man out, but it's been extremely impressive already today, and so I hope you're not going to be too bored with animals from the wild. Very briefly, what I'm trying to do is to say, well, we always think of intelligence as something uniquely human. I will argue it's not. I will also argue that it has a lot to do with brains. My wife always says I don't use my brain, but even some of us use our brain, and it has something to do with intelligence. That's very important because it affects how clever an animal can be. We'll find out that brains are constrained, severely constrained, and that means that what you do with your brain is going to really be very, very critical. And that'll lead me, after I've talked about ecology, to talk about cultural influences as that affect the efficiency with which you can use your brain, and therefore how intelligent you become, and that's exactly what Georgie was just talking about. So that's sort of the broad framework of what I'll say. And before I actually, speaking of brains, here are the brains of the operation. As I like to say, I'm in sales, they are in production. So, talking about intelligence, I won't critically define it, but it's something like learning from experience, planning, reasoning, as you all know, and you can measure it apart from IQ tests in terms of by looking at the outputs, behavioral flexibility, innovations, and stuff like that. And in humans, of course, there is, even though a lot of people don't like intelligence very much, it is something that emerges very, very predictably. This is Spearman's positive manifold. It's been replicated probably a few thousand times by now. And sample sizes, of course, are enormous. So even though nobody knows what it is, it's very repeatable and very predictable. What is it? Well, there's a lot of debate still. The killjoy explanations like, well, it's just if you have bad eyesight, you will score lower on all these tests. That doesn't seem to be working for humans. Again, there's been a lot of work on those things. It's also correlated with a lot of interesting other factors. So what it is exactly? Clearly naive, sort of, there is a spot in the brain that sort of controls all that. Those don't seem to work. The version I like is that it's a bundle of a lot of different things that have co-evolved, which means if you think in terms of natural selection, if one of those things is limiting the overall performance, it'll be selected for, and the rest will be, the selection will be relaxed. So they're co-evolved to give you sort of the same kind of output. And so it's sort of a system-level emergent property, which actually corresponds pretty well with a lot of the known facts. So for instance, inbreeding is bad for you. And the GWAS studies that have looked for genetic bases find lots and lots and lots of genes, all with tiny effects. So that seems to underlie this whole idea. It's sort of like height. It's a system-level property. I think one of the reasons a lot of people don't like intelligence is because a lot of the debate has, oh, well, that's very nice. Oh, you got it back? Yeah. Okay. So it was edu-room. A lot of people have used it to show that, for instance, men are smarter than women, or that particular groups are smarter than other particular groups, and so on, which, given the fact that, and what I will stress, of course, that it's developmentally constructed, is not only rather unproductive, because you can't change whether you're, well, okay, there's a lot of things you can't change, but it's actually, it's not very interesting, because what I find interesting is that it is developmentally constructed, so that makes it very interesting to look at, well, what minimizes it, maximizes it, etc. And all humans have it, maybe to a somewhat variable extent. And that leads us to ask, well, where does it come from? And do all animals have it? Do no animals have it? Is it based on language, etc., etc.? As you know, language is often part of these tests. And there is, in fact, again, something that is not very popular, but there is a bit of a correlation with brain size now. There's so many fMRI data out there that suggest there is some, and I'll get back to it when I talk about species differences, that is quite relevant. Again, we use our brain to generate intelligence. So that's sort of what we know about humans, and there's of course a lot more. But what about animals? And the general tendency among the differential psychologists, as this field is called, is to just nobody asks that question. And it's not been a very frequently asked question for a very long time. It was always implicitly assumed only humans have it. And where I come from, behavioral biology, and specifically behavioral ecology, they tend to think very much, we tend to think very much in terms of cognitive adaptations. Behavioral ecologists tend to ignore development. So it's a very different perspective, and very few people have even asked the question whether animals have it, and if so, how it would develop and how it evolved. Nonetheless, the subject has become sort of popular, and there's been several studies trying to come up with replicating the positive manifold G effect of Spearman. As you see here, there's been some fairly large sample studies with mice. There's several studies with birds. There are even some studies with primates. But all of these could be criticized, have been criticized, because in many cases, the sample sizes are tiny. And many studies, which also was a big deal in humans for a long time, you couldn't exclude alternatives. So for instance, if subjects vary in health, then of course the healthier one is likely to be more motivated and to work harder and so on, versus somebody who's not healthy, and you get your positive manifold as a byproduct. And there's another problem that, for instance, if I find 20 ways to estimate conditioning, and I find that they all positively correlated, well, what have I then really shown? I've measured conditioning, not really that there is the Spearman's positive manifold. There's a bit of a circularity in all these questions, but in humans that has sort of been resolved, in animals that has not always been resolved. But I should here praise Bill Hopkins and his group, who's done some really very impressive work with chimpanzees, where, sorry, disconnect. Coming back? Yes, it's too late. But they've done very impressive work with chimpanzees, showing that in a pretty large sample, you get your positive manifold, as that table suggests. There's 13 different tasks that he looked at. But he then went beyond that and also showed that, that for instance, the G is highly heritable. He finds that, that there's a correlation between your score on these tests, so your G loading, and cortical thickness, for instance, across individuals. He finds correlations with self-control. So all these things that we see in humans are also found in chimpanzees. We've recently tried to replicate this in orangutans, because we had a lot of orangutans that we could work with in rehabilitation stations. And sort of similar to Hopkins, we try to be as clean as possible. So the first thing there is, we call that the box test. So initially they can just slide the door, and then after a while they have to lift the door to see how flexible their reasoning is. We have something that looks astonishingly simple. It's the heart. It's the detour reaching. So there's a big hole here and a small hole there. The food is behind the small hole, and they have to overcome the tendency to try and get something through instead of just grabbing around it. We have the tube tap task. These are all largely tests that have been developed in primates and have been shown to work, sort of, where they can use their finger to push a peanut one side or the other so that it drops out and they can eat it, but you have to push it the right side so that it doesn't fall into the trap. And a reversal learning test, they have these doors that are pretty stiff so that they have to work for it, and initially say it's all behind the black, and then when they have passed criterion, put it behind the white and see how long it takes for them to figure that out. And we have a tool test where, with materials provided, where there's honey at the back of these little containers. I hope you can see my thingies there. And where there's a stick, but there's, of course, the stick won't work for the lower one, and they'll have to figure out that they need some flexible material. A lot of these tests are quite difficult for them, as you'll see later. What we did very specifically is we did not pre-train them, because these are not animals. Not all of them would work very well with people, so we just wheeled the whole equipment to them. It was filmed from a distance. Nobody was there. The wheeling was done by a caretaker, they knew. So no human involvement, so no sort of bond with human kind of effect. And what we see is very similar to Hopkins. We've only taken these 5 measures, one for each task, to be very conservative. As you see, it all loads pretty nicely, with the exception of tool use. And initially we had a second factor, but statistics told us we shouldn't use that, so it all comes down to one factor. The second factor is sort of tool use, because clearly their experience plays a big role, and some have it and some others don't. What we also could show is that health issues, because these rehab centers, of course, keep records of that, did not predict it, and I'll show you later there's evidence for developmental effects. So again, it looks like, at least in great apes, orangutans, chimpanzees, we see something very similar to human intelligence. So already one conclusion we can draw is intelligence is older than the human species, and even though language must have played a major role, it didn't create intelligence. Before this, actually, we were looking at how brain size affected various cognitive abilities, and we tried to look across species. I've done a lot of comparative work as well. And so with my former grad student, Rob Diener, years ago, we reviewed all the psychological studies, many of them like before the Second World War, and of course a lot of them right after, where people had done these classic psychological tests, but in a way that you can compare species, and you could rank the performance of the different species. Often it was done in the same lab, or some labs that replicated in identical ways, and so you get all these what we call paradigms. And our question was, okay, well, how do the chips fall? Do we find 6 axes or 9 axes? And to our surprise, this was done with the help of a statistician, because of course you have a very empty matrix, so it's a Bayesian analysis. To our surprise, 85% of the variation was explained by the first axis, which in those days we didn't dare to call intelligence, and what would we call them? Global measure. And it's, of course, I've always had trouble explaining these things to people, because they say, yeah, duh. Of course, lemurs are not as clever as great apes, but you first have to show it before that works. What is not in all these tests, as you see, is social tasks. And so for another project, we actually compared primates across a whole array of factors, ecological and social, so also taking in field measures, lots of field measures, and you see that the correlation between those two is very high, so it probably extends into the social domain as well. So it looks like, that's why we call it big G, it looks like something very similar is going on across species as what we see within species. But is it? So, as I said, the reason we did this was to look for effects of brain size, and we found a beautiful correlation with brain size. For our kinds of studies, these comparative studies, this is a really good correlation, actually. It's very nice. So there's something going on, and if these were all just a bunch of artifacts, it's rather strange that it would correlate so nicely with brain size. Again, in that other study that we've just done and haven't published yet, we see something very similar. But what's more convincing, perhaps, is that that G value that we get on the y-axis up there correlates beautifully with the measure that you may have seen the McLean et al. Paper. We were part of it too, where a lot of species were tested on 2 kinds of inhibitory control tests or self-control tests, and the scores of that correlate very nicely with the intelligence score, if that's what it is. And so, based on that, we think that yes, there is intelligence across species, not just great apes. You can have more or less of it, and how much you have of it strongly depends on brain size. You could look at whether it's particular parts of brain, particular regions. There's been some work on that, but the data are really too noisy to make much headway on that. And in the end, overall brain size turned out, in our case at least, to be the best predictor. So that suggests that we also think about brains. Now, brains are extremely weird. And how weird, I don't need to tell you perhaps, but I still would like to remind you of it. The first thing is they're very costly. And they're very costly at all times. So they require a lot of our energy. For instance, in your case, whether you're just sitting there, it's about 20% of your energy, even though it's only 2% of your body weight. As you can see here, people have been measuring these things. Yes, hearts and kidneys are more expensive, but they don't vary as much across species in size, and you can wind them down. You can't do that with the brain. The brain is always as active. Even when you sleep, it's just a few percent lower in energy requirements. And the brain always needs its energy, as that remark suggested. And when people starve, everything shrinks except the brain. That's called brain sparing. And they've done loads of experiments with rodents and so on. And even you can observe it in infants, preterm infants or malnourished infants. You see something very similar. The brain sort of grabs what it needs, and the rest will just have to accommodate. But that, of course, makes it hard to maintain a brain if your energy supply fluctuates. So brains are going to be hard to maintain. The second thing is that brains are useless until they have matured, differentiated, developed, until you have learned your skills. So for instance, here is data on our orangutans. On the left-hand side, the Bornean side, Tawanan on the right-hand side, Schaik, the Sumatran side. And we're looking at age, and they're weaned rather late, so 6 to 7 in Tawanan and 7 to 8 at Schaik. And we're always comparing how well they do relative to their mothers. So these are infants with their mothers. And what you see is that the simple stuff, just pick it up, stick it in your mouth, they get there pretty quickly. But the harder things, it takes them until well after weaning, until they've reached adult levels. So there's a lot of work going on before they finally get that brain up to adult standards. So, and of course, loss of time is loss of fitness. If another species would do the same thing without losing its time, it would, of course, do much better, another phenotype in the population. And in particular, the use of tools, which we have in this site, Schaik, and I'll have a few more things to say about it later, that is the last thing that comes online, so to speak. And they make totally ridiculous mistakes with these tools, even at the age of 6 or 7, until they finally get it. So brains are weird, and as a result, they might constrain the whole evolution of intelligence. And this is something I'll illustrate here with an example. So again, based on our comparative work. So normally when you look at a trait and the evolution of a trait, you say, okay, well, what is it good for? And it gives you fitness benefits. But in the case of brain, because it's so expensive, you also have to say, well, what does it cost? And can we find evidence for these costs? And of course, you can't keep on measuring all these things in fine detail in lots of species, but what you can do is look for the trade-offs that are maintained when you compare different species. If you still find these things across species, you know they're serious. And so what you expect is that bigger brains lead to longer lifespan, in other words, improved survival, and it does. This is all highly significant stuff. This is across all mammals. We also find it in birds. But what it doesn't do is increase your reproduction. And there's a strong negative correlation. The reason for that is, or at least one of the reasons, is that we find that larger brain species have very large offspring. And so it's sort of like a buffering thing, because remember these fluctuations. So human babies, for instance, are extremely fat, because we have, of course, by far the largest brains relative to body size. So we have to pad those babies to make sure nothing goes wrong during development. So you see how hard it is to sustain large brains. So the reproduction we can forget about, and the survival seems to work, but the development is another big one, and again, that's true for birds and mammals and primates too, that the bigger your brain, the longer it takes, but that's that filling cost that I talked about earlier. So brains seem to be a royal pain in a way. You'd rather do without it if you don't have to. And so it suggests that we should look for, assuming that intelligence is a good idea, is good for you, and that brains are required for that, it sort of flips the whole thing around. So who can afford a larger brain? What are the kinds of processes based on this scheme that would let natural selection favor larger brains? And the first thing we can look at is, well, does actually knowing stuff, having lots of skills, improve survival? And there are cases where it might not. There are cases where it might strongly do so. I will sort of ignore this issue today. We have some evidence for it. It's hard to test, of course, but I will especially draw attention to number two, and that is, what if the bigger brain and the greater intelligence you get with it actually helps you to come up with better food and less fluctuations in your food? That would be very nice, and then you can actually pay for the brain and you can get all the benefits from the larger brain at the same time. Because of general intelligence, you could then apply it to all kinds of other things. And the third one, which will come back later in the talk as the big one that I'm interested in because it's developmentally constructed, is this what we call the sociability filter. So, and it was already referred to in the introduction, these cognitive benefits don't fall from the sky. The brain doesn't just mature automatically. It needs inputs. It needs to be constructed, everything. And the more inputs, the better those inputs, the more your 1 gram of brain tissue will give you in terms of cognition. And that's where the whole development comes in, and that's why this whole idea is an evo-devo idea. And that's also why it probably might articulate with what you are doing here. I'll focus on this energy filter first and then come back to the sociability filter, just to make sure that it's clear that how important this whole energy business is for brains. One of the things animals do, some of them, is help each other and in the form of cooperative breeding, so provide energetic benefits to breeders. And in the case of cooperative breeding, that could be the male. There's always a male involved, with very, very few exceptions, or the helpers, the non-breeders. But the number of non-breeders is highly fluctuating, right? If you just start your career as a pair, there are none. And they might also decide after a good year suddenly to all leave and start breeding themselves, because suddenly there's opportunities to breed. So the stable component of the help is the male component. The fluctuating component is the helper component. And if this idea is correct, this expensive brain we call it, it should predict that brain size across species only responds to male care and not to helper care, and that the helper care should go into reproduction. And that's, in a large sample of mammals, that's sort of what we see, as you can tell. And here's a little illustration. Of course, we have to control for numerous variables. That's why these graphs always look very noisy. But if you control for all these things, it works. So it suggests that there is that the amount of energy coming in affects the brain, but only if it's stable. And here's another one that we've worked on quite a bit. This is mainly in primates, but we've now also done it for carnivores. It's the experienced seasonality. Again, it's fluctuations. So the more fluctuations you have in your energy intake, the smaller your brain should be. And vice versa, the more you can actually maintain your intake, the larger your brain can be. And that's what we see across primates, controlling for evolutionary dependencies and all that. And so it suggests that if you manage to keep your fluctuations in food intake down, you can afford to have a larger brain and therefore be more intelligent. So ecology really seems to be important in this And that's, of course, what I'm trying to say here. Energy inputs play a big role. And as a result, we could argue that, that it's really the ability to pay for the brain, and therefore ecological benefits that tell you whether or not your species can have a large brain or not, and as a result, whether it can be intelligent or not. And this may be surprising to some of you because everybody is now talking about the social brain. And the social brain, of course, is definitely important, but it can only be important if it piggybacks on the ecology that makes it possible. And that's one of the messages which may not be of main interest to most of you, but it's one of the things that come out of this work. So now let's switch gear a bit, because now the question is, okay, well, we know it's intelligence is important, brains are important, but how did it evolve? What's the mechanism? And this is what I call the Curious George model that seems to be the most intuitive. So you have a genetic endowment that leads you to be exploratory and learn things and curious, and that's Curious George. And as a result, you get a big skill set, and that gives you fitness. And there's some feedback loop. The more experience you get, the better you are at solving problems, and you innovate, and so on. And selection will stop this process somewhere where you've had enough, or where the costs are too high, or something like that. And so here's Curious George. This has not been articulated very explicitly, but a lot of studies have looked at innovation repertoires of species and compare them to brain size, and they always find positive correlations. So that suggests indeed that the smarter you are, the more innovative you're going to be. And so there seems to be something to it. But if you think about it, it makes a few rather obvious predictions that are listed down here. You have to become curious, right? So you approach novelty. You're not afraid of novelty. You explore quite intensively, and you make many innovations. And the smart species like orangutan should accumulate innovations over their lifetime. So let's take a look at these orangutans. I already told you we work at 2 sites, one in Borneo and the other in Sumatra, one in Swat Baliming. And we had artificial nests out there with novel stuff on them for months and months and months. And this is one of the closest approaches. So you see an animal occasionally scratching, very studiously ignoring this thing here, which is where the materials are, the new materials. Oh, it's not playing, is it? It stopped playing. Why is that? Well, there's no need to see the rest because nothing happens. And this was literally months and months and months, and nothing happens, right? And in one of the other studies we did were in these sanctuaries where some animals came straight in from the wild, you see the same contrast, because we also repeated this study in zoos, and literally what takes many months for an individual to even come close and touch the first thing, in a few minutes everything's gone in the zoo. So it's day and night, and this is very, very striking contrast. So wild orangutans avoid novelty like the plague, and sometimes they even give these so-called kiss squeaks, which means they're really annoyed by it, they're somewhat afraid of it. What is this? New stuff in my habitat. Also, there's not much exploration going on. I'll come back to exploration later on. And most importantly, we didn't see, we have over 100,000 hours of observations. We don't see anybody making a really cool new discovery and maintaining it. So if they have it, it's very rare. So it suggests that the Curious George model doesn't apply to orangutans and maybe some other species. And that got us thinking about it. And of course, if you think about it, it's dangerous what Curious George does. It's dangerous, as you know, curiosity killed the cat. In fact, now that we are looking at reintroduced orangutans, we have some examples of where animals that really know nothing in their new habitat are poisoning themselves. It's also incredibly inefficient. If there's all these adults out there that do things well, why not look what they're doing instead of reinventing the wheel without any input? So, and as we now know, that this is exactly what human kids are doing too. So it's very inefficient. Plus, if everybody just looks for their own innovations and doesn't look at others, if you make a killer innovation, you're going to have a one-off peak in fitness, but it doesn't get transferred to your kids. And so this is all not a very clever idea. So the cleverest idea, of course, is to go for social learning. And this is where the link between social learning and skill sets and learning ability and so on comes in. And so this is where we can go back to that third thing, which is what I really want to talk about, and it's looking at the sociability filter. And let's hope that this one does play. This is what we see in the wild if mommy does something very unusual. She picked up where's mommy? There, okay. She picked up a palm frond from the soil, and this is in Schaik where they normally don't come to the ground, and she is eating the pith of this. I've seen it once or twice. The infant also hasn't seen it very much. As you can tell, it's coming and closely observing what mommy is eating. It was playing up there 4 or 5 meters above the mother. And if we look at when that peering is happening, it's happening in the feeding context. So first look at the far right, other, when there's nothing going on, they don't peer. They peer a lot for social interactions, which in orangutans are not that common. Yes, they're sort of social, but they're not like buddy-buddy all the time. Nesting, they're very interested in nesting. They practice a lot of nest building and so on, but it's only once a day, sometimes twice a day. But feeding is happening a lot. So this is the quantitatively speaking, feeding is the most common context of this. And so we've focused, everything I say now is focused on feeding rather than nesting, for instance, where we could have exactly the same story. We have the data. So peering is the process of diet learning. And so, for instance, if you look at the peering, controlling for one or the other, complexity and rarity predict peering very strongly. So complexity is how many processing steps. So the more processing steps, the more complex things are, the more they peer. And the rarer it is in the diet, the more they peer, which make perfect sense. And so they do a lot of peering when basically they don't know. And but then the next step is interesting because they peer and then they go and do the same thing mom did. So for instance, what you see here is you look at the baseline rate before, which could include some remembered socially induced stuff before mom does it. But right after mom does it, you see a strong increase by a factor, what is it, 4-ish. And this has now been picked up by a lot of people. So for instance, Andy Whiten thinks that this is how our ancestors learned how to make pretty complicated stone tools, which are very complex in terms of having a long series of functionally related steps. And so we also think that the whole debate about can they imitate, yes or no, which was a huge debate in primatology for a long time, is actually sort of moot, because this can go on for months or sometimes years. And many aspects of the behavior, even if I were watching it, and I believe me, I can imitate, you cannot imitate because you can't see what exactly they're doing, or you have to feel it in your mouth and stuff like that. So imitation, I think, is sort of not the big deal here. It's in a way, it is reinvention. And because of this feedback character, you can see, hey, did I do it right? If something doesn't feel right, I look again, and so on. And so over the years, they practice these things. And initially, it's mom. Mom is it. So if you look at the very young ones, they focus on the mother. But as they get older, they get more and more interested in others. And I call this the mall effect. By the time they're teenagers, you don't want to be seen with your mother, and you're only focusing on others. And initially, those others than the mother are relatives. It's usually older infants, older offspring that come back and visit the mother, hang out with mother, or mom's sisters, or mom's mother. But as you can tell, again, as they are immature, independent and have left mother, so after about age 10, they are basically very interested in others. And even if they're with mother, they just don't peer anymore with mom. So it's sort of an expanding circle of who your role models are. And the exploration, in other words, is very strongly socially induced until they're independent. Then we see some more independent, so these red dots, some more independent exploration for food in this case. Among adult, it is very close to zero. We now have even more data, and it's even closer to zero. But this gets them by. So, for instance, by the time they're weaned, especially the females, have exactly the same diet as their mother. They even tend to overshoot a bit and then drop something, maybe from what they've seen others do. And it's also a sampling issue, of course. Despite having thousands of hours, they might occasionally eat things that we've missed. The mother's eating, the males do it a bit less. And it's not simply imposed by the habitat, because in Tuanan we had the sad but instructive situation that a female whose home range was being turned into a sand mine tried to move into our study area and was eating different things. And her kid was eating different things. And it's different from what the residents were eating. So clearly it's not just the ecology, otherwise she should be eating the same thing. So the wild orangutans tell us that they're basically parasites, the young ones. They're not trying to innovate, they're not trying to explore on their own, they just try to suck up what the adults have done. And what I didn't tell you yet, but is a fact, is that they have a massive skill repertoire for primates, dozens and dozens of things. And the reason they have it is because they're such good copiers, and if something is established, it is retained by this very strong copying and the buffering by checking with all kinds of others. And so you keep a large repertoire in place, but not because individuals invent these things themselves, but they reinvent everything that others have already invented. They're standing on the shoulders of their ancestors, basically. And so, assuming that has anything to do with intelligence, I mean, they're learning new things, after all, orangutans are not interested in what we think of as intelligence, right, or in innovation and so on. They're just interested in literally parasitizing on what their parents have done. And there's quite a few evidence of studies now that are coming out on people that suggest people are very similar. So if these social inputs are so important, we can make some very obvious predictions. And that is that if you have more opportunities for social learning, your skill set should increase, and your fitness too. But of course, if everybody in your population does that, you don't see the fitness effects anymore after it's happened. But you can compare skill sets across population in relation to the opportunities. And so that's what we are testing, because we have these two islands, right? So we have the Sumatrans that are a lot more sociable, at least in the sites that we work, than the Borneans. The interbirth intervals are roughly the same, slightly shorter in Borneo probably. But as I said, they're much more sociable in Sumatra, and even they also spend much more time within 2 meters if they're sociable. So there's a big difference in how much opportunities they would have to peer with each other. And if we now look at what these infants are doing, this is the same graph as before, but now I've separated the two islands. And what you see is these red dots are always systematically over the blue dots. And so the rich get richer, right? So in the rich population, and I'll show you that it's actually rich in skill sets as well, these animals, these youngsters, are more keen on looking what others are doing. And there may be some genetic influence there, but it could also entirely be developmental, because there's just so much to see. And we did some calculations, and we suggest that by the time they're adult, these Sumatrans have done about, 37,000 peering events with others, and the Borneans about 8,000, I think. Yeah. And so it plays a big role in their life, put it that way. So that brings us now to the exploration situation. What is it? Are they really exploring on their own as well? And it looks like there is an effect there of sociality. And also at the anecdotal level, if they do stuff, it's usually when they're together. And it's usually adolescents, by the way, when they're together. They sort of overcome their neophobia. We also see the same effect in adults, but of course it's much weaker. But overall, all these things are significant. So it suggests that sociability has a direct effect on exploration, and it has a delayed effect on exploration because of your exposure to all your role models. It sort of has a memorizing effect on you. And this is what we've measured here, where we try to control for all kinds of things, but we were interested in sort of your cumulative experienced sociability as you're growing up, how it affects your exploration, and we see a massive effect there. And you can control, here we did the z-test because so that we could put Tuanan and Schaik in one graph. It's just nicer to look at. But if you do it in other ways, it comes out the same. And also, of course, it's age controlled, but again, how we control for age doesn't matter. This effect is very robust. And so, if you have had a lot of individuals around you that could serve as role models, you become more exploratory. Largely because you've seen so many different things that, there's a lot more things you could explore, but it's probably also that you get more confident and that you start to then do things that you wouldn't have otherwise done. And interestingly, so once they've left their mother, we still see this difference. And as a result, these two populations do differ in their skill sets. So for instance, Schaik is the only place where they use tools quite extensively, whereas they don't do it in the Bornean site. And if we just look at the insect feeding techniques, it's about a factor 2 different in how many different techniques that population has. Also, if you look at the complexity of their feeding, you see there's clearly, every line is an individual, there's clearly a sort of half a step higher in Schaik than in Tuanan and Borneo. So to summarize where we are right now, basically the sociability that you experienced as a little orangutan affects your opportunities for social learning, of course, but that leads to a sort of a cascade of exploration, and that gives you a set of learned skills. What you don't see much is this individual input, so to speak, your independent input, and that's largely because they don't do a lot of exploration of things that haven't been explored by others in the population. And so we surmise that most innovations are by accident. We're now working with reintroduced orangutans, so they're totally naive to an area, and you see some animals that are totally curious, but that may have another cause that I'll come up in a second, because it looks like humans sort of exaggerate this effect that I just spoke about. The more inputs you get, the more curious you get. If you now look at animals that were with humans, they're off the charts. And so we have done some tests with animals in these sanctuaries, and this is all very standardized, so novel person, novel object, novel food, standard food, a little toy snake. How do they respond to this? And you get to make a long story short, you get, again, several PCs, but PC1 is by far the most important. It's about how quickly you respond to novelty, etc. So that looks like it's what we call curiosity. It's novelty response plus exploration intensity. And what we find is that that curiosity thing is strongly dependent on the age of arrival at the station, which means how long were they with people. Because they get caught when they're very young. When they're somewhat older, people don't want them anymore as pets, so they tend to get caught very young. And so the longer they're with humans, the more curious they've become. And as a result, what you see is that a lot of these tests you've already seen before, the more curious they are, the better they are at solving these tests. And in fact, if you now go back to that, and this is the developmental link, If you go back to that G study we did earlier that I spoke about earlier, curiosity also predicts G barely. It's not very strong as expected because it's just one of many factors. But the more time you have to explore and gather experience, as in humans, of course, think of the schooling effect, the Flynn effect, and all those things, the more likely you are to score highly on these sort of tests, the manifold tests. And so now imagine the following. This kind of situation lasts for thousands of years. So the Sumatrans have, it's a rich island, lots of volcanoes, as you remember all the tsunamis lately. So there's a very rich soils, high productivity, and Schaik has by far the highest density of any orangutan population in the world. Borneo is much poorer, much older, much less productive, and therefore the animals are less sociable. So if that lasts for a long time, how can this difference in the opportunities for social learning now affect what you're doing? And what actually is expected is that you get better at social learning. And as you saw, these animals in Schaik are very attentive. They're very interested in socially, if there's, let's call it learning opportunities, teachable moments. But what that is, of course, in the end, is actually selection on a social learning ability, because social learning is nothing but a filter before you actually learn, something that focuses your own learning activity. And remember, they're reinventing things. They're not just copying. Even if they were copying, it would already be quite something. I mean, it's very complicated. And so if this is correct, if we now look at Sumatrans and Borneans in captivity, where everything's the same, this is all European zoos, so European zoos are very deliberately trying to give them the best possible conditions with lots of enrichments, and group sizes are sort of similar and so on. And remember the difference, this is a general Sumatra-Borneo difference, a sociability difference in the sites that we've worked. What you see is that the Borneans do slightly worse on every single thing we've tested than the Sumatrans. And so it suggests that over time, even though the brain size difference is very small, over time the Sumatrans have become cleverer, more intelligent than the Borneans, simply because they had all this opportunity to socially learn and therefore could use their brains more efficiently than the Borneans. And this is the outcome. If you actually look at the mechanisms, the Borneans are just not as afraid in these zoo animals, interestingly, because we didn't find any of the difference in the wild. They go after novel food more. They also more often giving up, and they start to become rough. When they're exploring things, it doesn't work. They become rough and they become destructive, so to speak, which is probably adaptive. If you can't solve it cleverly, you might try to destroy something and see whether you get something out of it and then give up. And we also see when you look at especially that thing with the tools, the Sumatrans, again, they're all getting tools in the zoos. They're all getting materials. The Sumatrans seem to be slightly more inclined to go for relevant exploration rather than just random exploration. And so we call this cognitive style difference. It looks like the Borneans, with their slightly lower opportunities, have sort of adjusted, or the Sumatrans, either way, have adjusted their exploration styles to their innate abilities, or acquired abilities, perhaps. So coming back to this whole scheme and this 1, 2, 3 thing, we know there's some evidence for this life history filter, which I didn't talk about. There's good evidence for the energy filter and good evidence for the sociability filter. But most interestingly, of course, the first two are basically given for a particular species. But the third one is something you can play with developmentally. And so, especially for an audience like this, it's the most interesting variable. Yeah. Oh, it gave up on itself. And so the first conclusion was that primates have the brains they can afford, but the second one, that's most interesting for you probably, is that there are massive developmental effects, massive input effects on both the repertoire size and the intelligence, so the problem-solving ability of these orangutans, and that's what I say here. Why you should care is that, as in humans, we see a lot of construction going on during development. They start really naive, you might say stupid or ignorant, and then develop their skill set as they get older, and it's almost entirely based on cultural, social inputs. It's not independently achieved. And as in humans, you see that the amount and the quality of these social inputs determine the end point, which is why we came up with schools and education and why education works. And with that, I thank all these funders, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Hello. Did you or can you observe here? Yeah. So say some member of the species explores something new and has some sort of small accident or hurts himself. Would there be a difference in how the others learn from to avoid novelty or that kind of novelty, if there's some negative net benefit to it? Well, or I don't know, alternatively, can you somehow trick them in faking an accident and to check if there's something?
Well, that's a very good question. We have very little opportunity, of course, to study this because, like I said, most individuals, these are large populations, at least we study dozens of individuals, and many had dozens of opportunities to interact. We also had cameras on them, as you could see. They just don't touch it. The only times, and now we're going to do intelligence experiments in the wild because we figure out when they associated with us, and we're part of the furniture by now, and we're also role models for the wild ones. So if they associate it with us, they interact with it. So then we could do this, but I would have to eat something and then get really sick. And, yeah, it's a possibility. But I think in general, they might not be so attentive to it because it hardly would ever happen in the wild. And so they might not even be tuned to it. But it's a good idea. It's, you've given me an idea. Yeah.
Hello. I want to understand a little bit more about the differences between the orangutans in Borneo and the ones in Sumatra. And I wasn't totally sure that I understood the study that took place at the European zoos. Mm-hmm. It seems like there's three possibilities for these animals. One is that they were caught very young and that they were brought there, but they had some time originally in Borneo or Sumatra and picked up on the behaviors there. I guess another possibility is that they never lived there. They were originally from there, but they had mothers. Yeah. And therefore, it could be cultural learning being passed down across generations. And I guess a third possibility is that these infants were taken away from their mothers, never met them in the dark of night, and therefore we absolutely know that it's genetic. And I guess related to that, I also kind of want to know, are there differences in brain size between the populations? Because it seems like your theory should predict a difference in optimal brain size based on the social learning opportunities.
Right. So these were all zoo-born. And we made sure that that was the case. So we didn't have that kind of leftover effects of development. Also, the ones that are coming in from the wild, especially when they're somewhat older, they never become like your normal zoo animal. They just don't like people. There is a slight difference, and this is one of the weaknesses of that study. We think they're all from the regular Bornean subspecies, but there is one subspecies in the far east of Borneo that has a smaller brain. The zoo people always say, no, we don't have that subspecies in there but there could be a political element there, and that is that they don't want to admit that they're mixing subspecies. But as far as we can tell, we couldn't measure the brains of the actual animals, of course, that we were studying. As far as we can tell, the brain size effect is just difference is just a few percent. But the difference, of course, is what we predicted. And if I had the longer version of the story, and that's this life history filter, the eastern part of Borneo has very severe El Niños, when there's many months that there's nothing to eat. And we know that they're semi-nomadic there. One of our students has finally established that now. And so it's not a surprise that those guys have smaller brains. But admittedly, even if there were a brain size difference, the difference in intelligence with a difference that in humans would be swamped, is still giving rise to this this difference in problem-solving ability, and especially in this difference in cognitive style, which again is something that they came up with themselves because they're zoo-born.
And just to make sure I'm understanding, are zoo-born animals still raised by their mothers?
Yes.
Thank you.
And again, because we wanted to make sure that we controlled for the effect. There were a couple Borneans that were not mother-reared, but there was no statistical effect at all.
Thanks for the great talk. I was wondering, when I watched your video of the adult avoiding and maybe even kiss squeaking at the novel objects, it kind of reminded me of the Little Albert studies, where infants need a little bit of social input to learn to fear particular things. So I wondered if, I don't know if this makes any difference really for your theory, if you could sort of flip the way that you're characterizing it, that what the wild orangutans are learning is actually to fear novelty.
Yeah.
Rather than the other way around, so that animals, that there is a natural curiosity that's being inhibited by the
Exactly. I think in curiosity, as we call it, unleashing, right? We can unleash it, and even beyond just being the direct social induction, that after, if that's been going on for a while, you get a new individual. Think of enculturated apes, right? They are just as curious as anybody, but it's not what you expect a wild orangutan to do, because it really would be counterproductive, provided you can rely on others. That's why we're now working with these reintroduced orangutans that have no body. Well, they try to peer at each other, but if the ignorant peers with the ignorant, it's not very helpful. And their exploration rates are 10 times higher than what we see in our wild ones. And so, yes, I think curiosity is suppressed, and it can be unleashed, as it were. The door is open when there's this social element, and if there's a lot of social inputs, it sort of becomes autonomous, as it were. That's sort of what it looks like.
But just to push the point a little bit, it could be the case then that the years since introduction are your years since you've experienced a negative learning event.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than having humans facilitating or upregulating curiosity, like the social facilitator, rather it's just the longer it's been since you saw an orangutan look fearful around novel stuff, the more likely you are, and the more of your own experience you've had, that this pays off.
Yeah,
so I guess I'm just querying the idea that you're getting facilitation from humans.
Yeah, but it's true that the two cases where we had them interact was where we sort of inadvertently cued things. And so that suggests that the default is new, I don't deal with it. Unless there's a total crisis, I have to. And that's what we see with these reintroduced ones. By the way, the peering rates and the exploration rates went down after reintroduction. They're not quite there yet, but they are approaching the wild ones once they've been there for 2-3 years. So it is puzzling in the sense that it can be unleashed, but I think the default, it is solidly turned off. It's puzzling.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether, out of the many ways you can kind of speculate about these causal links, the social tolerance of the parent must be a very important factor.
Sure, absolutely.
In unleashing.
Yeah, if you broaden the whole net and say, okay, how important is this, and we've worked a bit on that, is of course, first of all, there have to be contact between parent and offspring. And that's why the octopuses are such a nail in my coffin, because they're very clever, but there's no contact between the parental and the filial generation. So they do it in a very different way. It has nothing to do with cultural intelligence. So that's number one. Second, of course, tolerance is extremely important. And in the case of humans, of course, as who's asking, it's the participation of the role model that makes a huge difference. Orangutan females just go about their business. we have very, very, very limited evidence for them facilitating the learning. If so, it's sort of indirect, so maybe they eat a bit more flowers when the kids are ready to explore flowers or something like that, but it's very weak. And again, the chimp data also, there's some controversy over it, but the way I read it, females don't do very much. But it's when they are sort of amongst adolescents, when there's still high tolerance, and girls can go to males, and the males are tolerant. So this is how they can pick up stuff from outside the maternal circle. And so you can sort of specify the conditions that would give you more or less, provided, of course, the ecology is such that you can afford the brain that goes with it. But at a given brain size, you know, holding everything constant, contact between parents and offspring generation, the number of what we call tolerant role models, the TRMs, are a critical issue, and how long you can stick with your parents and how long your learning window is open. We've seen these adult orangutans, they stop. I'm now stopping too. At my age, you know, I have a hard time with cell phones and all that, but we have opened that window and prolonged it quite a bit, plus we have this active role model involvement. And so I would have a slide on, what happened in human evolution. It's sort of pressing all these buttons at the same time. And this is where pedagogy comes in, of course, plays a major role.
Hi, Carel. Oh, sorry, I'm hiding. Do you see the hand?
Ah, yes.
More visible? Okay, I'll stop blocking the people behind me. So the question I have is, I'm trying to reconcile your cultural intelligence hypothesis, which seems to be consistent with Hopkins' G, with the Herman and Tomasello cultural intelligence hypothesis, which argues that there's a distinct social aspect that's independent of the physical aspect of cognition.
Well, I think what they argue is that the social one that comes online sooner. And you may know that that study has been criticized by people who say, well, the ecological validity wasn't very high because these chimps had to deal with humans and the human kids were dealing with humans too, so that's not quite fair. I think the answer is sort of in the middle. In fact, we came up with cultural intelligence the same year as they did, and so nobody's going to budge. But I think in the end, it is actually very, very similar, with the big difference of this role model involvement. And that's why, in humans, you can rely even more on the social inputs and seek it actively and so on. But I think fundamentally it's a very strong overlap between these ideas. In other words, what we see in humans goes back many million years. It's just that we've exaggerated the whole process. And so we need to look at the fine print exactly like, for instance, theory of mind. We need better tests for those kinds of things in apes to see whether that difference is really as big as we've been thinking for the last 10 years. Yeah.
Thank you, really interesting talk. So I see very clearly kind of the importance of social learning and having role models available. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit to kind of what pressures get role models, kind of get the tolerance off the ground. So the fact is you have to be able to learn from somebody, but that means somebody has to let you learn from them. So kind of what pressures are leading to...
No, that's actually a very important question. And I think it's one that has been underplayed in the literature, because basically maybe it's not a coincidence that they start with their mothers, not just because they're closer, but mothers are certainly tolerant. And remember that graph with the kin, the first 7 years, it's mainly kin. And those, of course, have an interest in making sure that their relative also gets up to standards of the local population. With non-kin, in this SWAC population, we see that non-kin are also much more tolerant to each other. In this Bornean population, it can be very nasty. We've even seen killings now. So they avoid non-kin, and we're working on a paper showing that they actually avoid each other before the association happens even. And it's only mothers having to occasionally let the kids play with each other because these kids need to play and sometimes there's nobody else. And then they're very leery about the other mothers. So clearly, The social tolerance is critical for the whole thing, as I mentioned earlier. And that could vary quite a bit between species, but also between populations within a species. And if your early experience is that you cannot really peer with others, that's it. Interestingly, we have the impression that the peering is now also used as sort of a tolerance requester by adults. So if I go up to you and I peer, it's like asking, look, I'm a little innocent, you know, small, I want to learn. Well, of course, they're not aware that they learn, but I just want to see what you're doing, and then you can decide whether you want to tolerate that or not. And usually males are tolerant to peering females, obviously.
So just to piggyback on that a little bit, is it a matter of how well resourced the environment is? Because it's easy to be generous when you're rich. Right. So if you're a mother and there is plenty of food to go around for food sharing or objects to play with, or babies to have and mates to have, because you have a lot of resources on this atoll, then is that a potential ecological mechanism for why the sociality may have evolved?
Yeah, in the orangutan case, because most primates live in groups, and the group size we can show is sort of limited by competition. There's a very nice paper by Charlie Jansen and Michelle Goldsmith that shows that. So by and large, group size is limited by competition, by ecology. Even though it would be nice to live in even larger groups, because then you have an even lower risk of predation. The orangutans come at the low end, and that's why a lot of these things are exaggerated in orangutans, because you start at such a low point and you still have this really strongly rising part of the curve. But the basic point you're making is exactly the point we've been making for many years. And that is, if you're growing up in a rich environment, everybody's nicer to you, they let you learn. And as you remember, that the repertoire of skills is much larger, even though SWAC is actually botanically less rich. And so they've just explored and exploited so much of that habitat compared to the other side. And that also means that everybody knows the LE effect in conservation, that if you fall below a certain density and everybody has a hard time and you don't have learning opportunities, these cultures can actually disappear. And there's now some work in Africa that is about to be published that suggests that chimps that are more isolated and more fragmented are actually losing cultures. So it really, it's in the end, it is ecology again in this case, but it unleashes all these social processes.
Hi. Thank you. I was wondering whether you clearly see this big group difference, but do you see any detectable individual differences within these groups?
Yeah, we see some. And of course, then we're running out of samples, of course, right? It becomes anecdotal, but we have some. In SWAC, for instance, we have got this one metroline that is very into technology, and they're using tools at every possible moment, and others do it much less. And clearly that is sort of passed on. But we also see, depending on this sociability, cumulative sociability effect, given variation across years and so on, we see that even infants of the same mother can differ somewhat. But I'm sure there is some genetic variability, although I forgot to say we also controlled for metroline effect and all that. We don't have the individual level genetics in descent. We don't know what matters, right, after all. But it looks like there is variability, yeah, even within populations.
And just to quickly follow up, do you, again, I know that the data is sort of limited for individuals, but do you feel like there's a trade-off for an individual? Whether is it just always better to be more pro-social in a society that's pro-social, or is there?
Well, I wouldn't call it pro-social, by the way, right? But no, clearly, I mean, think of all the years they take. I mean, these SWAC animals. See, it's a zero-sum game in the end. If everybody around you get cleverer, then at the end you're still back. Your fitness isn't going to be any higher from being clever. It's just that you have to be as clever as the rest within the population. And so you could imagine that, think of this incredible investment, like 30-some thousand peering events, and then followed by practice and thinking about this stuff and so on. It's a massive time investment. In their case, it pays off. We estimate that they get to be 60 in the wild, which of course should make you very conservative. You don't want to jeopardize your life expectancy by doing something really stupid when you're young. And that there's this famous Asimov novel where he talks about these people that lived on some planet and they got to be 300 years old and they're hyper conservative because nobody wants to take any risks. That's where the orangutans are going. Yeah. So yeah, there is a trade-off. Of course, how much you have to invest in becoming clever. Now, think of us. Here we are, 30-somethings, mostly without offspring, right? I mean, there's clearly a trade-off.
Questions?
Thank you for the fascinating talk. Well, you lay so much stress on sociability, the social factor, which influences intelligence. But as human beings, I think in the younger generation, this social factor seems to be more and more replaced with technology.
Yes.
So in the next 10,000 years, say we survive, do you predict a de-evolution because of this changing trend?
Interesting question. Before you say, well, the autists are not social, but they rely on all the social things that we've produced for them, right? They're using books, the internet, and so on. That is social learning in a way, right? So it's just a different form of social. It doesn't require the social tolerance anymore. Predicting the future is always hard, especially when we're not sure how much selection's going on. If everybody has 2 offspring and everybody has 2 offspring, then there's not going to be much selection of anything going on. Well, definitely, in this day and age, the ones that are less sociable can get to the same point or beyond of the sociable ones. But I wouldn't dare to speculate about what it will look like in, what was it, 10,000 years? I don't think we'll be there.
I was wondering for the reason why you call it reinvention and not imitation.
Like a reinvention.
Yes,
yeah.
And another further question, whether you think that imitation is not important or reinvention is more important. That's
Okay, so as you probably know, there's been this massive debate, and I've been on both sides of debate, and now I've decided I can be, because we know that, as Celia Hayes would say, the imitation ability is also developmentally constructed. And enculturated chimps imitate just fine. The wild ones don't, because they don't need it. The point is that it's never worth imitating something that you can't properly see. How did you learn how to tie your shoes? Just watch somebody tie their shoes. You go, what? I could never imitate that. This is sort of what they are up to all the time. So they could imitate if they needed it, and we know they can, because if you train them as an enculturation, they get very good at it. Even delayed imitation, a week later, they still imitate your actions. So in the wild, I think, because much of the important stuff you can't see, and it takes them months or years to figure these things out properly. I think also, the old experiments were ecologically so invalid that, we were expecting miracles. And so I would say imitation is something that you can developmentally construct if you need it, as an ape, as an orangutan or a chimp. I don't know about monkeys, maybe. Well, I think the Iriki experiments with Japanese macaques suggest also that even monkeys can do that. So it's not this black and white debate anymore the way it used to be, I think.
Yeah, just one short question. I'm not sure if I overheard, but did you talk about sex differences?
Just a tiny bit. Yeah.
Are there any sex differences in this population?
A little bit in terms of the attention. It looks like boys, as predictable. After a while, think their mom isn't terribly interesting, and they sort of try to look And they, for instance, they peer at males more. But that's just a footnote to the big story. The males are the dispersing. Sorry?
What about brain size?
Ah, yeah, of course. Well, males are much bigger, so they do have bigger brains. But and one of the reasons we do all this stuff, and the reason I did this big study with Rob Diener, was to see how do we have to control for body size? Because there's no theory that says, well, you have to control for body size as follows. What we've done so far is just is done circular by saying, well, we fit a curve and we look at the residuals. Well, what if larger species are smarter, which they are? Then that's useful. So, in fact, in our cross-species sample, we didn't have to control for body size because the body size effect is rather weak. But think of humans. Men have larger brains than women. Most tests say there's no sex difference. So clearly, some of that is simply to maintain a larger body, but there is no strong theory, and I'm still looking for it, as to what that slope should be to control. What we've done now is we just let the statistics take care of it and ignore the problem, which works fine, but it's not exactly elucidating.
If I understood correctly, right, it seems like a really powerful motor for evolution, if we take the Sumatra and Borneo example, would be group selection of some kind. That the group that both gets a larger brain size and also develops the sociability that goes with it would do much better than the subgroup that didn't have that. They take over more range or maybe be able to deal better with the conflict. What do we know about intergroup conflict or range expansion in orangutan?
Well, there's no groups. Right? It's very hard. But your general point is valid, although behavioral ecologists and evolutionary biologists shudder at the word group selection, of course. But for instance, what happened in humans, right? We, as cooperative breeders, one thing cooperative breeding does is expand your network of tolerant role models dramatically. And we've been modeling this stuff years ago, for instance, how to maintain tool use in a population. If you add a few role models each generation, it's there. If you remove them, it collapses. So cooperative breeding, which doesn't require group selection, leads to very good tolerance. And there's good evidence that cooperative breeders can actually live in habitats that are too extreme for non-cooperative breeders. So basically, the gist of your argument holds.
I'm wondering how...
Can you wave? Yeah. I know. Why do we want to have eye contact? It's just the way it is, isn't it? Yeah.
I'm wondering how certain birds that seem to be very intelligent fit into the bigger brain, more intelligent story.
Oh, I would say absolutely. We used to have this idea of bird brains, haha, small, stupid. Of course, as we now know, that's not true. Think of corvids and parrots and so on. They're just because they have to fly, they're more compacted, and the neurons are shorter and stuff like that. So there have been some studies in birds. Sample sizes were very, very limited. If we find evidence for general intelligence in birds, I think that would be extremely interesting. Because I doubt it's found in reptiles, although, never say never. But that would suggest that something like general intelligence will automatically have to arise when you make a brain bigger and more complicated. It's just, if this idea that I have is that it's a whole bunch of abilities that need to be sort of at the same performance level in order to work better, that selection simply produces that, there you have it. It would be very interesting to show that this convergent evolution has happened. It also makes you think about robots and all that.
Just a quick question about cooperative breeding. I mean, if cooperative breeders provide more role models, they are more tolerant, do you predict a larger brain size for cooperative breeders?
By and large, and this is something that I showed you that study where we looked at brain size and male care. The original study where we didn't tease apart helpers and male breeders showed that across mammals. there's a slight, so in other words, and it's also now being shown somewhat for birds. The problem is that in primates, the cooperative breeders are the small-brained callitrichids, they're dwarfs. And in primates, we have a significant trend in the opposite direction. But across mammals, it works beautifully. So yes, as always in biology, the answer is a bit equivocal.
Hi, thank you.
I see you.
I was wondering, so we have heard that role models are important, but also we've heard the orangutans are quite solitary, so they do not have necessarily a lot of role models around. Is there any data on species differences or group differences learning from other species? So if I observe some, I don't know, other primate solving a problem around me, I as a human, I guess I would benefit from that and I would use this information. Is there any data from the wild if groups differ in this respect, and if that would also show in their intelligence or problem-solving strategies, things like that?
It's a good question, but first of all, they're not that solitary. I mean, these orangutans in Schaik spend about 50% of their time in association. It's just that usually the association with one other individual, and not counting the infant. And in Borneo, it's like 10%, 15%, 20%, depending on the time of year and so on. We never see them really in tight association with other species. And also because everybody has different niches. So if you're an orangutan, who could you learn from? Only people. And it's an interesting anecdote that the chimpanzee nut cracking, the first hypothesis was that they had learned it from people. Now somebody suggests it's the other way around. But the point is that the opportunities to actually learn across species are, because of niche differences and lack of tolerant association, close race association, are actually rather limited. So I don't think it's a big factor, but it's theoretically definitely possible.
Thank you.
Sorry, this may be a somewhat therapeutic question.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I debated for a while whether I could ask this question, but so what did make our ancestors special? If there's so much, you know, we
go
know.
Back.
Yeah, I'm curious
Right.
what your take on.
Well, as it was already mentioned, I believe cooperative breeding played a major role in human evolution, but it's certainly not the only thing. But we're helping each other, and it also means, for instance, that if I can now explore things, I can take more risks because I know that if something happens to be, my group will take care of me. But I think initially a really strong impetus was the fact that we had more role models, but it's all positive feedback loops, right? So cooperative breeding, more role models, even just being out on the savannah means that we had to be tolerant and more male bonded in terms of social defense, and there was more food sharing because you get big carcasses. So all these things started to snowball into this positive feedback loop where technology became more and more complicated. In other words, you had to learn as much as possible, as fast as possible. And as I said before, our window, it stayed open much, much longer. For instance, hunter-gatherers reached in the case of men, reached their peak performance. I love to hear this, around 40, 45. And for women, it's 25-ish. And so clearly, age at first reproduction is much, much lower. So they keep on learning, humans keep on learning, where other species basically, again, it's a trade-off. Learning is a lost opportunity to do other things, especially if it involves long exploration and practice and so on. So, but something must have triggered it, and I think cooperative breeding was a big, and food sharing of large chunks of food and cooperative defense, that whole, humans became cooperators, and that, I think, put us on this road, as I sort of suggest there. Yeah.
Right. Last question.
Yeah, I would have it, but now I feel too much pressure. I wanted to ask about the nature of the energy resources, because you said more energy, you can afford a bigger brain, but if I'm surrounded by marshmallows, then I guess I just sit and eat them and vegetate.
Yeah.
So it seems that what you were saying just then about positive feedback loops, you could also talk about steps, historical steps, evolutionary steps, where if you're living in a habitat that is rich in resource, but defended, then it makes sense to socially learn because these things are hard to stumble across. But if you're a callitrichid and you're largely chewing bark and getting gum out of it, then you can have as many tolerant role models as you want. You're not going to learn a whole lot more about how to get gum.
Right.
So do you think the nature of the food resource is an important part of the story?
Probably, but it's, of course, these are feedback loops. And if you get more opportunities for social learning, if innovations happen, they are retained, so you could evolve away towards a much more complex niche. And one of the things that primates do, and only higher primates do, not lemurs and not carnivores we looked at, is what we call cognitive buffering. I think, yes, marshmallows are extremely scarce in nature, right? So most of it is junk, and you have to pick out the good things. And what we find is that buffering, which is, if we're looking at the variability in food intake or energy intake relative to what you would expect given the variability in fruit abundance in your habitat. Most primates, if they get a chance, they just eat fruit or eat fruit plus, but fruit seems to be the limiting thing. And this buffering is sort of how much less your fluctuations are compared to what you would expect based on the habitat. The more buffering you can do, the bigger your brain. So I think that's an important step. It's switching diets, and it's getting a richer diet, of course, that is very important here. And so it really, this buffering seems to be sort of one of the magical things that we have done. For instance, we hardly have big seasonality in our food, at least among foragers, with exceptions, because we just do something else. When food A is not there, we go after food B, or we move around a bit and we go for food C. And that seems to be something that is rare among species.
Thank you very much.